A girl stands on a porch at 11 o'clock watching a light through the curtains. That light is about to decide her whole evening. 25 rules like this one ran American courtship, and every single one of them worked. Picture a whole country deciding, almost overnight, that romance needed rules again. After the chaos of the war years, when couples fell in love over letters and married in a rush before a ship left port, the late 1940s and 50s brought something different. Courtship became structured again, with clear stages a couple moved through, each one marked by a specific object or a specific ritual, so that everyone, including the couple themselves, always knew exactly where they stood. The oldest ritual on this list was already fading by the 1950s, but it still mattered in smaller towns. Calling meant a young man asked permission to visit a young woman at her family home, sitting in the parlor under the watchful eye of her parents. It was a holdover from the previous century, and city teenagers thought it old-fashioned. But in conservative households, it remained the proper, respectable way a courtship began. Why did calling exist at all when it felt so stiff? It existed because a family's reputation rested on knowing exactly who was courting their daughter. A suitor who called on a young woman was making a small public declaration, visible to neighbors and relatives, that his intentions were serious. When calling faded out through the 50s and 60s, that visible seal of approval disappeared with it, and courtship became a private matter between two people instead of a family event. By the middle of the decade, dating had shifted almost entirely outside the home, and one destination dominated teenage evenings: the drugstore soda fountain. A boy would walk a girl to the counter at a Rexall or a Woolworth's lunch counter and buy her a Coca-Cola, often for just a nickel or a dime. It sounds like nothing today, but at the time it was a recognized low-pressure courtship gesture that everyone in that drugstore understood. The genius of the Coke ritual was how little it risked. A boy could buy a girl a soda without asking her to go steady, without any promise attached, simply to signal interest and see how she responded. If she smiled and lingered at the counter, he knew he had a chance. If she thanked him politely and left, the rejection cost nothing on either side. It let teenagers test the waters of attraction without the weight of a formal invitation. Once a couple decided to become exclusive, they entered the most defining stage of 1950s teenage romance: going steady. Unlike the dating around that dominated earlier decades, going steady meant a boy and girl saw only each other, publicly and by mutual agreement. It became so common in American high schools by the early to mid-50s that a couple who wasn't going steady by junior year could actually feel like the exception rather than the rule. Here's what surprises most people. Going steady was not seen as wholesome by the adults of the time. It was seen as alarming. Parents, teachers, and even some clergy worried that pairing off exclusively at 15 or 16 pushed teenagers toward physical intimacy and marriage-minded seriousness before they were ready. Newspaper columns of the era debated whether going steady should be discouraged in schools entirely, the same way parents today worry about unsupervised social media. This complaint actually reveals something the earlier decades lacked. In the 1920s and 30s, popularity was measured by how many different people a person dated, a competitive marketplace sociologists called the rating and dating complex. Going steady in the 50s was, in a strange way, a retreat from that transactional churn. Teenagers were choosing depth over volume, one steady relationship over a rotating cast, even if their parents did not see it that generously. Going steady needed proof, and the proof was visible from across a football field. A boy would take off his leather jacket, the one his school awarded for varsity sports, and drape it over his girlfriend's shoulders in the stands. From that moment, every student in the bleachers understood her status instantly. No one had to ask, no one had to guess. The jacket did the talking. The class ring worked the same way as the leather jacket, but it lasted longer and traveled everywhere. A girl going steady might wear her boyfriend's class ring on a chain around her neck or wrapped in yarn to fit her finger, since the rings were made for larger hands. It was worn to school, to church, to the malt shop, a constant, visible marker that told everyone exactly what today's ambiguous talking stage never quite manages to say. What today's daters call the undefined talking stage simply did not exist in this system, and that is the real thing that vanished. When a girl wore a boy's ring or jacket, there was no ambiguity to manage, no anxious wondering whether you were exclusive or just talking. The object did the defining. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because so much modern dating anxiety comes from exactly the blank space these small tokens used to fill. One step beyond going steady, and reserved mostly for college couples, was pinning. A fraternity man would give his fraternity pin to his girlfriend, usually a sorority sister, signaling a commitment more serious than going steady, but still one notch below a formal engagement. It meant the couple was moving toward marriage, though not there yet, and everyone on campus understood the specific weight that a pin, as opposed to a ring, was meant to carry. Pinning did not happen quietly. Fraternity brothers would gather outside the sorority house after dark, sometimes carrying candles, and sing together beneath her window to announce that one of their own had pinned a sister. Dozens of the couple's classmates would gather to watch from the lawn and the porch. It was a small, ceremonial performance, half celebration and half public record, the 1950s version of an engagement announcement broadcast to an entire campus at once. Below going steady and pinning, jewelers marketed a cheaper token aimed squarely at younger couples not yet ready for a diamond, the promise ring, sometimes called a friendship ring, sold through mail-order catalogs and small-town jewelry counters, often for just a few dollars. It let a couple signal seriousness without the financial weight of an engagement ring. It was affordable enough for a teenager's part-time job wages and codified enough that everyone knew exactly what it meant. Every one of these object rituals, the jacket, the ring on a chain, the pin, the promise ring, worked because they replaced conversation with evidence. A couple did not need to have an awkward talk about where the relationship stood, because the object already answered that question for anyone who looked. It is a small mechanical trick, but it is one that modern dating, built almost entirely on verbal check-ins and vague texts, has quietly lost. No courtship ritual carried more weight than the engagement ring itself, and its dominance in American life traces to a specific advertising campaign. In 1947, De Beers launched the phrase, "A diamond is forever," and through the following decade that single slogan reshaped what a proper proposal was expected to include. Before that campaign, plenty of couples got engaged with no diamond at all. After it, a diamond became close to mandatory. By the 1950s, a diamond engagement ring typically cost a few $100s. A real but manageable expense for a young man just starting out, often a soldier home from the war or a fresh graduate beginning his first job. That price tag mattered because it kept the ring within reach of an ordinary courtship timeline. Couples were not waiting years to save for a ring. The way many do today, they were engaged within a season or two of going steady. The entire system, from calling to the diamond, existed inside a culture explicitly oriented toward early marriage. The GI Bill fueled a housing boom, with entire new suburbs like Levittown springing up starting in 1947 and expanding into the following decade. And courtship in this era was designed to lead somewhere specific: a mortgage, a household, a family, and quickly. Dating was never meant to be an open-ended search. It was the on-ramp to a very particular destination. That marriage-minded urgency shows up starkly in the numbers of the decade. The median age at first marriage for women dropped to about 20.3 years old, and for men about 22.8, historic lows according to Census Bureau records. And by the end of the decade, roughly half of American brides were teenagers when they married. It is a statistic that startles modern viewers, but inside the 50s courtship system, it was simply the expected timeline. Marrying young does not mean marrying without any guidance, and this era produced a formidable machine of advice designed to walk young women through exactly that. For decades before the 50s even began, Dorothy Dix wrote a syndicated column read by millions of American women, answering questions about courtship etiquette with plain spoken authority. She was, in many households, as trusted a voice on matters of the heart as a mother or an aunt. In 1951, Dorothy Dix passed away, and her decades-long reign as America's courtship authority came to an end. But the appetite for that guidance did not fade with her, it simply waited for a successor. Newspapers across the country understood that young readers still needed somewhere to send their most private, most anxious questions about boys, dates, and the murky rules of romance. In 1955, Epi Lederer took over the Ask Ann Landers column, and it quickly became one of the most powerful voices shaping how young Americans understood courtship. Readers wrote in under pseudonyms, Worried in Ohio, Broken-Hearted in Toledo, asking whether it was proper to kiss on a first date or whether a girl was allowed to telephone a boy first. Landers answered with a firmness that made her column a de facto national rulebook. The following year, in 1956, Pauline Phillips launched a rival column called Dear Abby, and almost overnight the nation had two competing authorities on courtship etiquette instead of one. Together, the two columns doubled the reach of codified dating advice into American households, syndicated across hundreds of newspapers. A teenage girl confused about a boy's behavior now had two trusted strangers to consult before she consulted her own mother. These columns are worth pausing on because they reveal something people often get wrong about the era. The image of 1950s dating as universally chaste simply is not true. Advice columns were flooded with anxious letters about necking, about petting, about how far was too far, and about parents terrified their daughters were going too fast with boys they were going steady with. The wholesome postcard image is a retrospective gloss, not the world these letters actually describe. Magazines aimed at teenage girls carried the same etiquette instruction in a lighter, glossier package. 17 magazine, and Calling All Girls, ran regular features spelling out dating rules in plain language. Rules like never call a boy first and let him open the car door. These were not vague suggestions. They were printed as firm etiquette law, reinforced issue after issue, so that a girl always knew the correct move even before her first date arrived. One of the most rigid rules in this printed etiquette code was the telephone. A girl was never, under any circumstance, supposed to call a boy first, no matter how much she wanted to hear his voice. The reasoning was blunt. A girl who called too eagerly looked desperate, and desperation was considered the single least attractive quality a young woman could display. So she waited, sometimes for agonizing days, by a phone she was forbidden to pick up. Once a boy did call, an entirely separate telephone rules kicked in. A proper young man was expected to speak with confidence but never monopolize the family phone line for too long, since most households shared a single line the whole family needed. Etiquette writers even coached young men on exactly how to close a call gracefully, because a fumbled goodbye could undo an otherwise perfect evening's impression. On the date itself, financial etiquette was just as codified as anything else. A boy was expected to pay for virtually everything: the movie tickets, the malt shop bill, the gas in the car. But the rule cut both ways. A respectable girl never let him overspend or pay for anything extravagant on an early date, keeping the outing modest so the gesture stayed generous rather than obligating. In exchange for a boy's spending, a girl was expected to reciprocate in kind, though never with money. She might bake something and send it home with him, or write a handwritten thank you note the morning after a date, or invite him to a family Sunday dinner as a gesture of gratitude. It created a small, ongoing cycle of giving on both sides, a kind of courtship economy that modern dating, built on splitting a bill evenly, has almost entirely abandoned. The car door itself was its own small ceremony. A boy was taught, explicitly, to walk around and open the passenger door for his date every single time, without exception, whether arriving or leaving. It was such a fixed expectation that a boy who forgot could actually damage his reputation among a girl's friends. The gesture cost him nothing but a few steps, yet it communicated respect in a way words rarely could. When a date ended, the ritual continued all the way to the front door. A young man was expected to walk his date up the path and to the door itself, not simply drop her at the curb. Many families used the porch light as a silent signal system. Light left on meant come in and say a proper hello to the parents. Light switched off, or a strict curfew already passed, meant the evening was firmly over. No lingering allowed. There was no equivalent gentle exit in this era for a bad match. No simple silence. No vanishing without explanation. Ending a courtship, especially once a couple was going steady, required an actual conversation and often a small ceremony of its own. The rules demanded closure, however uncomfortable, and that expectation shaped how seriously people entered a relationship in the first place, knowing they could not simply fade away from it. When a couple did break up while going steady, the class ring or letter jacket had to be formally returned, and it usually happened in a place as public as where it had first been given, the school hallway. A girl handing back a boy's ring in front of classmates was instantly understood by everyone who saw it. There was no confusion about the relationship status, no lingering questions, just a clear, almost ceremonial closing of the chapter. That public ring return is, in some ways, the 50s equivalent of a changed relationship status today, except it happened in front of real people instead of on a screen. Everyone in that hallway understood instantly what had happened and why, without a single word of gossip needed. It is a strange thing to admit, but a piece of jewelry handed back in a hallway once did the emotional work that an entire evening of texting now struggles to accomplish. In more traditional households, before a young man could even begin calling on a daughter, he was expected to ask her father directly for permission. It was a formal, sometimes nerve-wracking conversation, standing in a living room or on a porch step, stating his intentions plainly to a man who held real authority over whether the courtship would even be allowed to begin. Refusal was possible, and a father's word on the matter was usually final. It is easy to read this rule as pure male gatekeeping, and in one sense it was, but etiquette guides of the era also gave women specific, codified power within that structure. A young woman had the recognized right to refuse a caller entirely, to decline a boy's attention without needing to justify herself, and advice columns coached her explicitly on how to say no firmly and respectably. Her father's approval mattered, but so, ultimately, did her own. Chaperones deserve more credit than they usually get in modern retellings. At school dances, sock hops, and mixers, a teacher, minister, or parent was required to be present in many communities, especially outside the big cities, standing along the wall for the entire evening. It looked, to modern eyes, like pure surveillance and restriction of teenage freedom, a wall of watching adults at every school dance. But chaperones actually served a more generous purpose than pure surveillance. Their presence gave young women social cover, permission to attend a mixed-gender event, and interact freely with boys without any risk to her reputation, because a respectable adult was there to vouch for the whole evening. In a strange way, the chaperone's watchful eye gave girls more freedom to socialize, not less, because it made the entire gathering respectable in the eyes of the wider community. The one place chaperones could not reach was a car parked under an open sky, and that is exactly why the drive-in movie theater became the era's most notorious dating destination. By the late 1950s, thousands of drive-ins operated across the country, and parents specifically distrusted them because a couple could sit alone in a car for hours with no supervising adult anywhere nearby, all while still technically attending a sanctioned, respectable date activity. The drive-in is the clearest example of a pattern that runs through this entire era, a strict rule-bound courtship system, and teenagers finding legitimate loopholes inside it. Every generation finds the edges of its own rules. What made the 1950s different was that even the loophole, the drive-in date, still counted as a properly sanctioned activity a parent could not object to on paper, even while quietly worrying about it in practice. Not every courtship followed identical rules across the country, and this is worth saying plainly. Rural and small-town America held on to older customs like calling and chaperonage much longer than fast-growing suburbs did. Black, immigrant, and working-class communities often developed their own distinct courtship traditions that differed meaningfully from the white middle-class norms depicted in mainstream magazines and advice columns, even while living through the very same decade. Even within the decade itself, the rules were not frozen in place. Early 1950s customs, chaperones, formal calling, family introductions were noticeably more conservative than the customs of the late 50s, when drive-ins, malt shop culture, and greater teenage car access had already loosened things considerably. A girl coming of age in 1951 experienced a meaningfully different courtship world than her younger sister coming of age in 1959. Wartime courtship left its own fingerprint on the decade that followed. During the war years, traditional calling and chaperoned visits were impossible for couples separated by an ocean, so letter-writing courtships became the norm, along with hasty engagements before a soldier shipped out and USO dances as makeshift meeting grounds. Many of the young men and women who invented the 50s rulebook had themselves fallen in love first through handwritten letters and borrowed dance halls. Those wartime letters carried a specific kind of intimacy that in-person courtship rarely allowed. A soldier and his sweetheart, riding across an ocean with no telephone and no visits possible, often revealed more of themselves on paper than the rigid etiquette of a chaperoned parlor visit ever permitted. Some couples married within days of a reunion, having built an entire emotional bond through nothing but ink, stamps, and months of waiting. Weekly dances at the local school or community hall gave the whole ritual system a stage to perform on. Sock hops, named for teenagers dancing in socks to protect the gymnasium floor, brought together everyone at once. The going steady couples with their letter jackets and rings on display. The newly interested pairs testing the waters near the punch bowl. The chaperones along the wall watching it all unfold in one crowded room. Curfews were another quiet but firm ritual, enforced not just by police but by the porch light and the family clock. A girl was expected home by a specific hour, often 10 or 11 on a school night, and a boy who returned her even 5 minutes late risked her father's disapproval and future visits being restricted. It taught both teenagers a specific discipline, that respect for a family's rules was inseparable from respect for the girl herself. Introductions themselves followed a small script. A boy interested in a girl he did not already know was expected to be formally introduced, often through a mutual friend, a sibling, or at a school or church function, rather than approaching her directly on the street. This structured first meeting, awkward as it could be, meant both young people entered the interaction already vouched for by someone they trusted, lowering the risk on both sides. Church itself functioned as one of the era's most reliable courtship venues, particularly in smaller communities where the congregation doubled as the entire social world. Sunday services, youth groups, and church socials gave teenagers a sanctioned, supervised space to meet and interact, with the added weight of a shared faith community watching, encouraging, and occasionally matchmaking on the side. Family dinner invitations marked a serious milestone in a courtship's progress, more serious than most modern daters realize. Being invited to Sunday dinner with a girl's entire family, sitting at the table under the direct scrutiny of her parents, grandparents, and siblings, signaled that the relationship had crossed from casual into something the family considered worth evaluating. A boy's table manners that evening genuinely mattered to how the courtship proceeded. Handwritten letters between a couple who lived in the same town, not just those separated by war, were also a genuine courtship tool. A boy might slip a short note into a girl's locker or mail her a letter even though he saw her daily at school, simply because putting feelings into careful, considered handwriting carried a weight that a passing hallway conversation could not. Girls often kept these notes for years afterward, tucked in a keepsake box. The corsage ritual turned school dances into small, formal ceremonies of their own. A boy was expected to buy his date a corsage, typically a small arrangement of carnations or roses from the local florist, and present it to her at her front door before the dance began, sometimes pinning it himself under the watchful eye of her parents. It was a costly, deliberate gesture that announced the evening mattered before a single dance step had happened. Prom itself was the culmination of the whole system, and it followed its own strict etiquette calendar. A boy asked weeks in advance, often in person rather than by phone, matched his tie to her dress after consulting with her mother, and arranged transportation that met with parental approval. Every step was scripted, but the scripting itself is what made prom night feel significant rather than just another Friday evening out. Physical affection had its own quiet, unwritten hierarchy that everyone absorbed without ever seeing it printed anywhere directly. Holding hands was appropriate. Almost from the first date, an arm around the shoulder came. Once a couple was known to be going steady, and a goodnight kiss on the porch was permitted but expected to be brief, given the very real possibility of a parent watching through the window at any moment. Girls' magazines devoted entire columns to managing exactly this tension, coaching readers on how to keep a date affectionate but respectable, how to gently redirect a boy who moved too fast, and how to do it without causing a scene or damaging a reputation that could follow a girl for years in a small community. It required real social skill, deployed calmly and without ever seeming as dramatic as it actually was. Group dating served as a kind of training ground before a couple went off alone. Several couples would go to the movies or the malt shop together as a pack, which let shyer teenagers get comfortable in mixed company before ever committing to a solo date. It was considered entirely appropriate, even wise, and many going steady couples could trace their beginning back to one of these looser, lower-pressure group outings. The high school yearbook became an unofficial ledger of every courtship the school had witnessed that year. Couples signed each other's yearbooks with inside jokes and declarations, and a girl, flipping through the pages years later, could trace the entire arc of who went steady with whom, who broke a ring return in a hallway, and who eventually married the sweetheart from their sophomore homeroom. Even the family car played its own quiet role in the ritual system. Access to the family sedan for a Saturday night date was treated as a genuine privilege a teenager had to earn through good behavior and a clean curfew record, and a father handing his son keys carried an unspoken message of trust, both in his driving and in his conduct with the young woman he was picking up. By the very end of the decade, teenagers were gaining more independent car access than any generation before them, and that shift alone quietly eroded the older supervised rituals faster than any single cultural debate could. A couple with a car no longer needed the parlor, the chaperone, or even the malt shop counter. They had privacy on wheels, and every rule built around supervised proximity started losing its grip the moment that happened. The turning point most historians point to arrived in 1960 when the birth control pill received FDA approval, beginning a slow but real erosion of the entire chaperoned, ritual-bound courtship system built through the previous decade. It did not happen overnight, but the shift in sexual mores it set in motion made the old rules, calling, chaperones, formal permission, start to feel less like protection and more like restriction to a rising generation. Through the early to mid-1960s, going steady itself came under open criticism from parents and clergy who had once merely worried privately. Now they said it plainly in sermons and newspaper columns that pairing off exclusively two young pressured teenagers toward premature intimacy. The very ritual that had defined 50s teenage romance was, within a decade, being actively discouraged by the same institutions that had watched it take hold. By the mid to late 1960s, the most formal courtship rituals, calling cards, chaperoned parlor visits, asking a father's explicit permission, had become genuinely rare rather than merely old-fashioned. Youth culture was shifting toward informal, group-based, far less supervised dating, driven by broader social changes the country was experiencing all at once. And the old ceremonial structure simply could not keep pace with how quickly everything around it was moving. By the 1970s, going steady, pinning, and the whole escalating ladder of promise ring engagement ring had largely faded from mainstream teenage culture entirely. Dating became more casual, less explicitly aimed at marriage, and less defined by any single object or ceremony a couple could point to. The ladder of tokens that once made status so legible simply stopped being climbed by most young couples. It is worth naming plainly what modern viewers often miss, that this decline was not purely a loss. The constraints that came bundled with all this structure fell disproportionately on women, whose autonomy over their own courtship timeline, their own bodies, and their own choice of partner was often subordinate to a father's approval or a community's watching eyes. Nostalgia for the ceremony should never mean nostalgia for the limits placed on who got to choose. And yet something real was genuinely lost alongside those constraints, and it is worth being honest about both halves of that truth at once. The clarity, the legible stages, the physical tokens that told a couple and everyone around them exactly where they stood, these things reduced a specific kind of anxiety that modern dating has never quite solved. You could disagree with the rules and still recognize what the rules were actually good at doing. Today's dating landscape, filled with talk of app fatigue, ghosting, and the exhausting ambiguity of an undefined talking stage, has fed a real renewed interest in mid-century courtship's clear, codified stages. It is not that people want the father's permission or the curfew back. It is that they miss knowing, without asking, exactly what a relationship is and where it stands, something a class ring on a chain used to answer without a single word. Online trends built around trad aesthetics, vintage etiquette reposts, and old-fashioned romantic imagery have kept these 50s visuals circulating widely. But most of that circulation only shows the surface, the poodle skirt, the malt shop, the corsage, without the actual history underneath it. That gap between the aesthetic and the real texture of how these rituals worked is exactly the space this channel exists to fill. There is also a renewed interest today in what people call slow dating, fewer dates, more intentional ones, clearer communication about where a relationship stands. It echoes some of the structural bones of 1950s courtship, the defined stages, the physical markers of status, without asking anyone to bring back the restrictions on who got to choose or how much say a woman had in her own courtship. You can take the clarity without taking the cage. Think back to the class ring on the chain, the letter jacket draped over cold shoulders in the bleachers, the porch light glowing or going dark. None of these were complicated inventions. They were small, cheap, physical objects and gestures that did something modern dating still struggles to do. Consistently, they told the truth about where two people stood, instantly and without an argument. None of this means the 50s had it right, and we have it wrong, and none of it means the opposite either. It means a specific decade built a specific system, with real costs and real benefits, and that system eventually gave way to something looser and, in many ways, freer, especially for women who no longer needed a father's permission slip to fall in love with whoever they chose. What stays with me most, after all this time spent inside these old columns and catalogs, is how much thought went into every single gesture: the nickel for a Coke, the corsage pinned at the door, the porch light left burning. People were not leaving love to chance back then. They were building it, piece by deliberate piece, the way you might build anything meant to last. So the next time modern dating feels like an unreadable maze of mixed signals, remember that girl on the porch from the start of this video, watching a single light for her answer. She had it simpler in some ways, harder in others, but she was never confused about where she stood. That clarity is the real thing we lost, and it is worth understanding before we decide whether we want any part of it back. If you loved stepping back into this world with me, There are so many more of these forgotten rituals waiting, the ones that never made it into a single history textbook, but shaped how an entire generation fell in love. Subscribe and come back for the next story, because I am nowhere near finished digging through these old letters, columns, and courtship codes. Thank you for spending this time with me and with all these forgotten couples. Tell me in the comments which ritual surprised you most: the porch light, the Pin Serenade, or something else entirely. Until next time, this has been Clara's Forgotten Romance, and I will see you back here soon for another story worth remembering.